Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. Hey everybody, welcome back to Shannon's Lumber Industry Update. Today is episode 123. I'm going to be talking about our featured species, which is African Sapele, and I want to talk about wood movement and drying difficulties, and frankly, the drying difficulties that are really are wood movement. That's how it presents itself. So thank you for tuning in the show, and thank you as always to the folks who continue to support this show on Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/lumberupdate, you can find out how to sponsor the show. And for that matter, since we're doing a featured species sticker mail out this week, that's how you get one of these stickers, by supporting the show on Patreon. If you have questions, I want to kind of throw this out there right at the opening. If you go to this website, lumberupdate.com, or go to Instagram at Lumber Update Show, you can submit questions. You can direct message me. You can leave a comment on Instagram, or going to the website, there is a contact form there. Of course, you can also just email me directly at lumberupdate@gmail.com. I greatly appreciate the questions. I've got quite a few questions this week coming straight from patrons, but also from people who've been submitting things on that contact form. In fact, I've got a question that's really, really old that I'm finally getting around to. So if you submitted a question and you never got an answer, have faith, I'll get to it, or just submit it again and say, hey, I'm asking this the second time. What gives, man? Give me my question. So let's move in here to some feedback. I think it was the last episode, I had a guy who wrote in who was drying some redwood cookies. And I got an email from Steven who did use some pentercryl. If you remember, pentercryl was I think I called it the nuclear option when it comes to drying a cookie like that. And that's really what that product is designed for. Steven said that many years ago, his dad had a large red oak that fell on his property. It was probably about 24 inches in diameter. And he decided to cut several thick, 3 to 4 inch thick cookies out of it. It was still very fresh, very wet. And he got a gallon of pentercryl and soaked one of the cookies in it. And the idea was to kind of submerge it if possible. He was using a kiddie pool. So he partially submerged it and then essentially basted the top and kept it thoroughly wet. He said that it seemed to be fine for about a week or so, but then it developed a nasty crack from the bark to the pith that opened up to about 3/4 of an inch wide at the bark end. I was still willing to make my tabletop with the rest of it, so it was okay. Coated the entire thing in Envirotex epoxy, including filling that crack. The logic was the thick epoxy would have no trouble sealing in the remaining moisture and holding that crack stable. Long story short, it didn't work. After a couple of years, the crack opened further, pulling away from the epoxy, but also warped badly despite the apron and the legs on the table holding it in position. Now, in contrast to this, about 1 to 2 years later, with that same log, he cut another couple of cookies from that same log. It was immediately adjacent to the first ones that he cut. So again, wood grain was very, very similar there. These he split in half and made the ends into a coffee table. So he cut them in essentially half moon shapes, 2 halves of a log. And didn't use pentercryl that time, but just used only a polyurethane finish. They've cracked a tiny bit, but nothing like the canyon that opened up on that wet one. So he says, my recommendation is to get those logs dry as much as possible before cutting into cookies. There just isn't enough strength between the pores to hold the cookie together when it wants to shrink. And this is a really good point, and I think I kind of glossed over that in my original question about the redwood. The gentleman asked the question, remember I told you he lived in Florida, but he got these in California. He anchor sealed them, put them in the bed of his truck, and essentially blew dry them as he drove from California to Florida. A lot of air moving across the wood, and they were quite dry. All of the free water was gone from them at that point. But this is a good point. If you've got a freshly felled log, there is a hell of a lot of water in there, probably 80%, if not more, moisture content. You want to get the free water out of there. You can either gravity drain it. You can do a little bit of heating to drive some of that out. Once you get the free water out, generally you're down to about 25 to 30% moisture content. The other thing is just by slicing it into a cookie, you're going to allow that free water to come out pretty rapidly. So you can slice it into a cookie and then maybe use the Pintercroll like the next morning, probably less than 24 hours, but let some of that air moisture come over it and remove some of that free water, get that moisture content down below 30%, then use the Pintercroll. Now, the thing that Stephen brought up here, they didn't have cracking on the second one. Well, he cut those into half moon shapes, which is going to dramatically reduce the amount of movement. The whole cookie doesn't have any place to go. And when you saw that first one cracked and opened up that like pie-shaped crack, well, when you cut it in half, you essentially sawed that crack and released a lot of tension. So your experiment isn't really one that you can say is kind of an apples to apples comparison. Just by cutting it in half, you're relieving a huge amount of stress. And I would think just plain old polyurethane would be perfectly fine. So yes, Pintercroll could work. Depends upon the species, right? There's going to be variances, but trying to get as much as that moisture out, certainly the free water out, is going to be very important. And later in this episode, we're going to talk about free water and bound water. So if you're not sure what I'm talking about there, stay tuned for later on in the show. So excellent feedback, Stephen. It's one of those things that you always have to be very conscious of the species you're dealing with and just how recently it was felled. Anchor seal can be a great kind of in-between to get some of the moisture out of the log. But here's the other thing. I've talked about this in the past. Keeping it in log form, not cutting it up at all, it will hold on to its moisture for a very, very long time. So just keeping that, in your case, Stephen, that 24-inch round, it could stay damp in the middle for a very, very long time. So you might want to do some cutting if you're making cookies out of it. Maybe say you're going for a 2-inch thick cookie, cut it to 3 inches thick, give it a little bit more strength, or 4 inches thick. Let some of that moisture dry out. Then you could possibly even cut it in half to get 2 slightly less than 2-inch cookies, and then apply the Pintercroll from there. So it's always kind of like, a step down process from really, really wet to a little bit drier to a little bit drier, trying to relieve the stress as slowly as possible. So speaking of wet wood, Mike wrote in and he said, going back and listening to old episodes again, because it's fun. I agree. I just noticed you said something like, that's probably fine for you and other hobbyists, etc. But if you don't have a fumigation certificate, you won't, you have to disclose that, and you can't use that lumber in any commercial development. When referencing backyard solar kilns, I think that's where that came from, not staying at temperature over time. So to get a fumigation certificate, you got to raise the heat and hold it there for 48 to 72 hours, 72 hours to be certain. If you can't hold it that way in a solar kiln, then it'll be difficult to get that fumigation certificate, and you'll have a hard time selling, especially a bug prone, like a reclaimed ash or an oak or something, because you won't be able to get fumigation certificate. So using it commercial purposes might be really difficult. So Mike goes on to say, does framing material or other construction lumber not need these fumigation certificates? Sorry if this is a dumb question, but it just caught me off guard when you said that, because there's no way the 2x4s and 2x6s at my local big box store have been kiln dried based upon the water squirting out of them when they're cut. This is a really good question. There's a lot of stuff hidden in this, why I wanted to throw this in as feedback. Mike, construction lumber is most definitely kiln dried. It is absolutely kiln dried. There's no way you could sell it or get any of the grading stamps if it had not been kiln dried. And the fumigation certificate is built into the kiln drying that goes on. There's a lot of stamps on the end of construction lumber or on the face of construction lumber. You'll see a lot of stuff that may not mean a whole lot. That means it's been kiln dried and it passes a fumigation certificate. There's a bunch of other stuff built in there based on the grade and the species and all that fun stuff. But the reason that your 2x4s are squirting wood is because of how they are dried. They're still kiln dried, usually in a dehumidification kiln. But if you remember, the last step in kiln drying is reverse case hardening. So we hear about case hardening. We need to think, oh my God, that wood is case hardened. It's ruined. Case hardening is a natural step in kiln drying. You drop that temperature down, or raise that temperature and drop that moisture content down until it's about 0. And at that point, essentially the wood is case hardened. But then you rehydrate it. You add more and more moisture back into this while it's still at heat. That rehydrating reverses the case hardening. So again, what is case hardening? Case hardening is when the outer layers of the wood becomes dry, and the inner moist, creamy center is still wet. If it's allowed to stay that way and set, that outer shell, that case that's around it, hardens as it dries, and it can crack apart or cause cell collapse or honeycombing, all kinds of nasty stuff. The difference with case hardening in a kiln process is you're bringing it down to a case hardened state, but before it has time to set that way, before it has time to dry out and form that hard outer case, you reintroduce moisture and you reverse the case hardening. Now you're bringing that outer layer that's ultra dry into equilibrium with that inner layer. And in some instances, you're pulling more moisture out of the inner layer because you're at high temperature, but you're bringing that outer case and that gooey center into equilibrium. So you've got uniform moisture content throughout the board. With structural lumber, it's dried very, 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 very fast. And then it is flooded with moisture and brought back up to a 6 to 8% moisture content. Well, that huge amount of moisture, then it's pulled out of the kiln. Everything is dead stacked, strapped together. And the nature of the softwood itself means that it's filled with free water. And when you cut it, it's literally got water squirting and dripping out the end because of the structure of softwoods being a whole bunch of tracheids and not really the complexity of pores and porosity and all that stuff we talk about with hardwoods. That water is mostly free water, and it's able to just hold there in the structure. So I said earlier we're going to talk about free water and bound water, and I will a little bit more, but the important thing to recognize is the wood does not deform until the free water is gone. Until you start to alter the bound water content, there will be no shrinkage or expansion. So you can have bound water at a certain level. You can inject a whole lot of moisture to reverse the case hardening and drive that moisture content up, but the wood is not really going to swell that much because the bound water is staying the same. So you may have driven some of the bound water out of the cells during the kiln drying process. When you brought it down to zero, the reverse case hardening is bringing that moisture level back up, but you're still saying the bound stuff is still staying relatively the same. So as that's squirting out, that's just free water. If you took that stud and you stood it up vertically, I've talked about gravity drying in the past, it would drain all that water out. So that when you did cut it, it wouldn't be squirting out of it. So it is absolutely kiln dried. The cell walls have been hardened. It's been dropped down to a certain moisture content. The temperature's been raised up to allow for that moisture content to bleed out of the wood. Once those cell walls harden, the addition of water, it's that dry creek bed analogy where water will not absorb as readily, and it will also shed water just as quickly. So that's that squirting coming out the end as you're sawing that board. Excellent question. And I want to reiterate that kiln drying, the natural process, is to re-inject moisture at the very end so you don't case harden it. If you do it really, really quickly and you have the structure that allows for the absorption of a lot of free water, there's every chance that your kiln dried material, I don't even know why I'm using air quotes. If you're watching the video at this point, I just did kiln dried in air quotes. It is still kiln dried. It's just got a lot of extra kind of bound or free water in the structure there. Let's move on to some industry news here. Who is this? Bobby sent me this video on the Japanese forestry. And actually should turn the sound off here. This is, and Bobby said this is actually a really interesting kind of microcosm of the entire forest trade. It is a particularly interesting video. It's just a broadcast segment. It's 30 minutes long. No commercials or anything in this particular format. But it is in English, although they interview quite a few Japanese people and they show subtitles and things like that. But it basically walks through every aspect of the Japanese forestry ministry and all of the various products and trades that benefit from it. So certainly lumber, but they talk about the paper trade. They talk about pharmaceutical. They even talk about a form of sake that's made from wood. It's very, very interesting in how the Japanese government, it's an island, right? It's a tiny little island, just like Britain. They always have had issues with forestry because it's an island. You can't just keep expanding and expanding. Japan, even more so, has had to become incredibly sustainable and figure out better ways to manage their forests and to replenish their forests. So Bobby's absolutely right. Japan is a tiny little island, but how they manage their forestry and the detail that they go into this, and just as a woodworker, I love this. There's some really amazing woodworking going on here, but also some fascinating stuff about forestry management in a highly closed system, a very small closed system. This could very easily be scaled up to a global forestry plan, and what Japan is doing here should be lauded. It's really, really cool. So watch this and think about your own neck of the woods, and you can very easily put parallels between what the Japanese forestry ministry is doing and what New Zealand is doing, what Germany is doing, what, heck, the state of Maryland, where I live, is doing. Really, really cool, Bobby. Thank you so much for sending that my way. Let's move to my next little headline here. Mass timber construction reaching new heights in Canada. You've heard me get excited about mass timber. It's ironic because I work for a company that does nothing with mass timber. We are a traditional hardwood company, but I continue to get excited about mass timber, cross-laminated timber, glue-lam timber, GLT, CLT, DLT, NLTs, nail laminated timbers, dowel laminated timbers. There's a bunch of different sheathing, LVLs, laminated veneer layer, all kinds of mass timber construction. Well, it's taking things higher and higher and higher. In Canada, specifically Ontario, the province of Ontario, has amended its building codes to allow for mass timber construction that is right now 12 stories high, taking it up to 18 stories high. So maybe you wouldn't call that a skyscraper. I don't know. It's pretty dang tall, but now you can build state of code up to 18 stories tall. Honestly, I don't remember what it is in the US, but it's not 18 stories. My brother has done some building in and around Denver with mass timber, and I think they were around 10 or 11 stories. And that was really pushing it. So Canada, again, they're producing a fair bit of mass timber up in Canada, and they're continuing to kind of get behind this as a construction method, as kind of not only construction method, but a production method. There's a lot of industry in the creation, distribution, sales, all that of mass timber construction. So very, very cool. It was really cool to read that particular article. Shall we move on to Sepil, our featured species of the month? Sepil, here it is, right here. Here is a quarter sawn piece of Sepil. It's got a nice polish on it. You can see here's just a plain side, and there is polished side. Let's see if we can get a little bit of that. There's that nice sheen. This is just polished with a polissoir and a little bit of wax, kind of lightly on that. But this is African Sepil, Intandrophragma cylindricum. It is, I wanted to talk about this. It's a little bit more of a mainstream species. There's probably a lot of people out there who have had a chance to work with this, who have purchased it. It is a mahogany-like wood. Sometimes it's called Sapele mahogany. It is an African wood, grows all across Central Africa. You're going to find it in Ghana, Cameroon, the DRC, both of the Congos for that matter. It is a typical African tree in that it's quite large. Let's see, it can be anywhere about 150 or 45 meters tall, 5 feet in diameter. What is that? Like 2 meters, 1.5 meters in diameter. It's a big tree. It's a buttress tree like a lot of the mahogany type species. It is in the Meliaceae family or the mahogany family, but obviously it's not, genuine mahogany. South American mahogany is in the Sweetina genus. This is Intandrophragma. Sepili and Utili, Intandrophragma Utili, Intandrophragma cylindricum, Sepili, are very, very closely related and oftentimes very difficult to tell apart. Every year at my office, we have a barbecue and somebody lays out a bunch of species and does like a species identification thing. And the Sepili Utili one always gets people. Like there's only probably a handful of people at my company who can tell the difference between the two other than looking at the tag on the end. They're very, very similar. But there is quite a bit of difference between Sepili and genuine mahogany. However, Sapele really began to gain popularity and prominence as a commercial species back in 2008. Or actually, I should say more like 2009 and 2010. In 2008, genuine mahogany was an Appendix 2 CITES listed, and it became very difficult to get. When you list a species on CITES, there are different ways to control it. Sometimes it's just greater regulation through paperwork. Sometimes it's greater regulation through global quotas. And genuine mahogany was one of those ones that was subject to global quotas. The total amount of genuine mahogany that could be shipped was dramatically reduced. Went from like hundreds of containers to like 10 containers globally. So genuine mahogany fell away, and immediately companies like the one I work for began to push people towards Sapele. And honestly, my company and many others like it have been talking about Sapele for years prior to that. In most instances, Sapele and Utile have been widely used in Europe for decades, centuries actually. There's a lot of people who hypothesize and have done some X-ray diffraction studies on antique furniture from like the golden age of furniture from the 18th century. European, like real Chippendale furniture, in many instances was constructed from Sapele or Utile. And if you think about it, the lumber trade, when it comes to Europe, the lumber trade started in Africa before it started in the New World. Before they even knew that North America was there, the Dutch East India Company was trading and bringing lumber up from Africa. So African Sapele, African mahogany or the Kaya genus, and Utile were already in trade in Europe. And Thomas Chippendale himself probably had several pieces of furniture in his collection that were not made from mahogany like you might think, but were probably made from something like Utile or possibly Sapele. That trade has been around a lot longer. So it goes to show that Europeans have been using this material for quite some time. North Americans in general tend to be really stubborn and are forced to make changes. Mahogany was CITES listed, and several people continued to use mahogany and just until they couldn't get it anymore. Until basically the near inventory that was already in the country was used up. You trying to get people to shift to these other species, and they're like, you know what? I'm going to stay where I am until they just absolutely couldn't. And that, really took to about late 2009, middle of 2010 before basically everybody had switched over to Sapele and Utile. That's not to say that genuine mahogany is not still being used in some areas. It can still certainly be gotten. And in the, decade or more since the CITES listing, we've actually seen quite a recovery in the genuine mahogany forests. In other words, CITES is working. But that's genuine mahogany. This is Sapele. And I bring all this up because it explains why Sapele has become so popular. Now, the first thing you might ask is, well, if Sapele was taking over the mahogany trade, is that bad for Sapele? Well, the thing about Sapele is it has a much wider geographic distribution. It is found all over Africa. It's also being planted in Asia and South America. It's kind of everywhere. The other thing about Sapele is it is an enormous tree. It's a large buttress tree like genuine mahogany, but it gets even taller and even thicker. And basically are no defects. Like there are no knots in these trees and little to no sapwood, like a tiny little sliver of sapwood. So it's really easy to get wide, really long and thick timbers of Sapele. 12 quarter, 16 quarter Sapele, not at all uncommon. 12 foot, 15 foot, 18 foot boards, also very common. 12 inches, 24 inches wide, no problem. Actually, the hard part in finding boards wider than 12 inches in Sapele is not because of how the tree grows, because there's not that big of a market for it. And the mills are actually sawing it into marketable widths, like 6 to 8 inches, because that's what people are buying. 12 inches is doable, but rarely do you see above that because it's not a whole lot of market demand for it. And this is typical of a lot of species. People say, oh, don't grow them like they used to and everything is really narrow. It's not actually true. It's just they're sawn into what the market demands, that 6 to 8 inch width. And this happens very much with Sapele. But because Sapele is also used heavily in veneers for plywood, you will find people peeling logs, but also going for that quartered look. So plywood, very common Sapele. You can get it in flat sawn, but most of it is quarter sawn like this. And this is that distinctive ribbon striping. All of the interlock woods in Africa will show some amount of ribbon striping. Utility shows it, African mahogany shows it, heck, even genuine mahogany can show it. But Sapele is dead straight. It's like pinstripes. Each one of these ribbon stripes is nearly parallel to one another. You notice, here's a big 8/4 by 10 hunk of Sapele. I got a bunch of these in my shop and in my lumber shed out back because it's just really easy to get. I built my panel clamps out of 16/4 Sepil. Yeah, it's really easy to get in these enormous sizes. And that's one of the reasons that it's gained so much popularity, but also one of the reasons that it's not even close to threatened. There is so much Sepil everywhere, and it's coming in, in huge container loads. They are well-managed forests. There are certainly areas of Africa that maybe are not managing it as much, but I'm speaking for my own company, but I'm speaking in large part for the North American trade. We're not buying from those countries, frankly. Most of it is coming out of Cameroon, Ghana, Ivory Coast, a lot of stuff along the coast there. And as I mentioned, both of the Congos, the DRC and the Republic of Congo. All of those countries are producing a huge amount of Sapele, and the reforesting that's happening is already there. So this is a great species with a nice long future. And I think that's what's finally allowed it to kind of take over and become more widely recognized. A little bit of technical stuff here. Hardness is 1350, sometimes 1400. So, quite a bit harder than genuine mahogany, but in line with, something like white oak or hard maple, if you're used to working with those domestic species. MOR of 16,000, MOE of about 1.8 million. So again, in line with, hard maple, very similar, MOR and MRE. That's a good one to compare it with. Its movement tangentially 7.2%, radial 5.2%. So there's still quite a bit of radial movement, but it's a 1.4 TR ratio. So it's a quite stable wood. There's a lot of woods out there, 1.6, 1.8, and 2.0. So even though it moves a fair bit, both tangentially and radially, that kind of works because you end up with a much more uniform species. Therefore, it is quite stable. The quarter sawn, we think of quarter sawn wood as a great way to have, that was a really loud motorcycle that just drove by. Quarter sawn wood, we use it for great stability. Really, the reason that this is quarter sawn is because of that ribbon stripe. That's what people really like it for. It's more stable, but 5.4% radial movement is about the same tangentially you would see in black cherry. So you can see it still moves a fair bit, but because of that lower TR ratio, it can be quite stable. It is a diffuse porous wood. Pretty solitary pores. Sometimes you'll find some radial multiples. It is an interlocked grain, so you've got this kind of double helix thing going on in the grain. One layer of growth will move, the grain will move in one direction, the next layer of the grain will go in the other direction. That's what produces this ribbon stripe. I like this board better. Oh, despite it being really heavy. Each one of these darker, as you're looking at it from here, this darker band, we're seeing more in grain, which is why it's darker. This lighter band next to it, I'm seeing more face grain. And that's due to how that double helix, as it's coming up and intersecting with the face, we're seeing that in grain as the grain curves around. If my fingertips are in grain, and as it's spiraling around, and as it starts to come back towards the camera, you're looking at in grain. Well, at the same time, can I use both hands here? You've got another one going the other way. So I'm seeing face grain on one band and in grain on the other band. When you quarter it like that, that's what produces that. And that's really why it's become so incredibly popular in large panels, why it continues to get guillotine sliced for plywood. Honestly, though, huge for veneers and plywood, huge in cabinetry. This is an outstanding exterior wood, so you find it for exterior trim all the time. It often gets painted. And I'll touch on this, but the cost has come down very dramatically to the point where Sapele is actually cheaper than most of the North American domestics that we're finding. There's so much of it. The trade is so well established that the prices continue to fall. I recently developed a line of exterior cladding for my company. We used a bunch of different, actually 6 different species in it. And for the most part, Sapele is the cheapest of them. And we're using, white oaks and cypresses and jataba, even modified woods. The Sapele still comes in cheaper than that. So while it's a mahogany substitute, it's not nearly as expensive as what genuine mahogany used to be, and certainly not what it is today. So in some ways, this has become kind of a paint grade wood. It's beautiful, but because it performs so well on an exterior basis and because it's relatively inexpensive, there are people using it for doors and windows and soffits and exterior molding and trim where it all gets painted. It also gets used certainly in an unpainted capacity. It gets used a lot for decking, exterior structures like pergolas and trellises and things like that. And it like all woods, will turn to a nice silver gray as it weathers. It has truly taken over that mahogany market, and in such has taken over all of the boat builders. So those vintage Chris Craft boats with the beautiful mahogany decks, those tend to be made out of Sapele now. Actually, many of them were made out of Sapele back then too. Same reason I talked about the Dutch East India Company bringing Sapele in well before Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and all that fun stuff. So alternatives, I've already mentioned Udali. It's a dead ringer for it. I probably have some Udali in the shop. I know I have some in the shed. Honestly, I could hold it up to the camera, and in the quartered, you will not see quite so much ribbon striping, but it will still be relatively parallel. It just won't be as pronounced. Really difficult to tell them apart, even side by side. Flat sawn, I find, is the only way I can tell the difference between Udali and Sapele, and it's just how the early and the late growth comes together. It's almost a dead ringer. Certainly genuine mahogany is an alternative if you're looking for a more expensive alternative. African mahogany, anything in the Caius genus, is a possible alternative, but that interlock grain there tends to be much more random, and instead of giving that parallel ribbon stripe, you get kind of a wavy, the band goes thick and thin and they move all over the board. That also makes that a heck of a lot harder to work with. The grain is much more prone to tearing out in African mahogany. It's a lighter, less dense wood, so certainly, something worth looking at. I didn't even mention that. Density on this is 0.56, so definitely up there in the densities. It's actually a couple of points higher than maple. About the same as white oak, denser than red oak, though, and about 42 pounds per cubic foot there. Other kind of less, red balau is one that you could think of. Canberra could also be an alternative to these. Both have mahogany-like grain and have that kind of deep red-brown color. That's one thing I will say with Sapele is it is much deeper red than any of the other mahoganies. Certainly, African mahogany tends to be more pink. Genuine mahogany goes huge variation. Like mountain genuine mahogany, like from Bolivia, is going to be that deeper red, similar to the Sapele. Brazilian or Mexican, like Guatemalan mahogany, much pinker, looking closer to like African Kaya mahogany. Sapele tends to always be that nice deep red color that we're looking at here. That's it all the time. Occasionally you'll find something that tends to be a little bit lighter due to the wide geographic distribution of Sapele. It's possible that as you move south into the Sahel area and that transition as you move into the Sahara, you can end up with some less dense and therefore not quite as deep red material. Red balau is very similar to Sapele in that respect. Also, it's primarily used these days as a decking material, but it's got that nice deep red color. Meranti is another one to look at. Meranti is in the Sharia genus, or generically known as Philippine mahogany. So it's an Indonesian mahogany-like species. The true Meranti is going to be quite dense, denser than Sapele, but it's going to have that deep red color. But there's a lot of different Merantis that fall under that Sharia. And Luan, by the way, you've heard of Luan plywood. If you go to Home Depot and buy Luan plywood, it's that reddish Philippine mahogany. Some Merantis can go that direction as well, but I think air quotes, true Meranti is going to have that deep red color as well. The other one to look at would be Macquarie. It's another species that does have some nice ribbon striping. It also presents a nice quilted, almost a bee's wing figure to it. Not quite as deep red, kind of tending more towards the orange, but a lot of similarities in working properties. So, certainly the mahogany type species have been so heavily touted and exploited from a marketing perspective. I mean, everything's mahogany. The fact that Sapele is sometimes called Sapele mahogany or African Sapele mahogany. You throw mahogany in and it screams luxury. So mahogany, people have been looking for alternatives for mahogany for centuries at this point. Sapele, I tend to think, is kind of the cream of the crop. When you're looking for that mahogany look, that deep red brown, Sapele is probably what you're going to buy. Workability wise, as I said, it's interlocked, but it's really not nearly as prone to tear out as like African mahogany. The one thing I will tell you about Sapele is it's quite dusty. Give you the sniffles, certainly. I know some people who have had skin irritations from Sapele because it's so fine particulate. It's a very hard, very dense wood, run through power tools, heck, even sawing with my handsaw. It produces a lot of dust, a lot of fine dust. So definitely get yourself a respirator. If you find that your skin is prone to these sensitizers, consider long sleeves. Obviously, there's a balance with long sleeves when it comes to power tools. As a hand tool guy, I don't really think about those things much, but something to think about. It can certainly be a sensitizer due to that fine dust nature of it. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say about Sapele. Great species. I've got a lot of experience building cabinets, building furniture, building, turnings, boxes, just about everything I've built from Sapele because it is just so easy to get at. If you haven't used it and you're looking for that kind of mahogany type look, I urge you to look at it. Genuine mahogany is a beautiful wood, low hardness, very homogeneous structure, makes it great for carving. But due to the recovering nature of that species, the grain is so hit or miss. And really, because mahogany is of a lower density, that variation you get from the northern end of its range all the way down to like southern Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, it's almost an entirely different species. So it's kind of a roll of the dice, a crapshoot, if you will, when it comes to buying genuine mahogany these days. If you're looking for more consistency and you can kind of count on what you're going to get, Sapele is the choice for you. So again, if you are... I've worked with Sapele, let me know. I'd love to hear your feedback, your experience with it. If you want one of these fun stickers like I've just been showing on screen, become a Patreon supporter. If you support it at the walnut tier, I will be mailing one of those. Everybody who joins the walnut tier and is active in the walnut tier during the month of April, all the way up through April 30th, you're going to get one of these mailed out to you. So thank you again to all the supporters of the show. And I've been hearing some great things from people who've been getting their stickers and getting samples of the wood and sticking their sticker to it. Other people are just sticking it to the wall of their shop. Some people are using these bookmarks. I've actually used these as bookmarks a fair bit. All right, let's move on to some questions, shall we? I got to say, so many questions just falling from the sky, hitting in my inbox over the last couple of days. Thank you guys for sending in those questions. And it helps shape the show, but I also want to reiterate the fact that sometimes it takes me a while to get to it. And my first question is one of those examples. It comes from Andrew, and I think he submitted this to my contact form probably 2 years ago. So sorry, Andrew. I don't know why it took me so long to get to it, but yeah, things get buried. And if you're watching the video, they get buried like a bunch of pallets falling from the sky. If you're not watching the video, imagine pallets raining down from the sky because that's what's happening on video right now. I know. I'm playing with video effects. I'm having fun with it. Andrew said, and I quote, "Back when I was younger and dumber, I made a desktop for a friend. It threw wood movement out the window. It's now 5 years later, and not only is the desktop still in one piece, but it hasn't even cracked. It has survived being built in western North Dakota in the winter, super dry, to be moved to eastern Minnesota in the summer, quite humid. Not only that, but the joinery between end grain and edge grain is only a butt joint with no reinforcement. The top is made from purple heart and maple, so it makes me wonder, are there some species that you're more likely to get away with breaking the rules? I made the top in mid-spring when I was between the moisture extreme of winter and summer. So is it possible to hit the middle of the moisture extremes and get lucky as well? I understand now never to do this again, and I will always think back on this project and cringe. I wait for the phone call telling me that it is finally self-destructed. This is a great question, and it reminds me sometimes as we get into woodworking, a lot of times we're completely oblivious to wood movement, like Andrew said, and we just build whatever. Then we learn about wood movement, we become incredibly paranoid about it and are afraid that every piece we're going to build is just going to explode one day because of wood movement. I often urge people to say, you know what, chill about the wood movement. Yes, wood moves, but rarely does it move like, destructively, explosively. Wood is moving very slowly. If you're using kiln dried wood, it's moving even slower than that. For that matter, most of our homes have some sort of climate control in them. And you'll find that in many instances, the house where that piece of furniture is going to live is actually drier than maybe that shop that you built it in that's in a garage like me or down in the basement or something like that. So one of the things that Andrew's looking at is, yes, he built it in a very dry area and it moved to a wet area in Minnesota. But in the homes, in those climate controlled homes, I don't think you're going to find that much difference between North Dakota and Minnesota. Not dramatically, not like 10, 15% moisture content, maybe 5%. But that's not really that much when you think about it. And when you think about wood, especially kiln-dried wood, the walls have been hardened in that high heat. They're slow to absorb moisture. So as you move from North Dakota to Minnesota, yes, there's going to be a moisture difference, and it's going to slowly raise the moisture content of that wood. But if it's only a 5% delta, that's not going to do anything. And the climate control in our homes kind of ameliorates or levels out the moisture swing from winter to summer. Certainly, I think the least advantageous time for furniture is in the winter with the heat blowing, because then the moisture content can get down to like 0 or 2%. But a lot of modern climate controls have humidifiers built in to prevent that from happening, prevention from the itchy skin and the static electricity every time you touch a doorknob in the house. We've kind of evened a lot of that out. So there's a lot of things that you can get away with. But the more direct answer to this question is, yeah, there are some species that are going to be less prone to it. Certainly, the more even your TR ratio, the closer to 1 your TR ratio is, the less that wood is going to move that much. The type of glue you use can have something to do with, but also remember, wood movement is a percentage game. If a species moves 6% tangentially, and as he talked about, he had edge grain and end grain coming together in a cross grain. Well, if this board is 4 inches, which it is 4 inches, well, 6% of 4 inches is going to be less than 6% of 12 inches, like this white oak. So if you've got individual boards that are glued to end grain, well, they're going to be moving relatively small amounts there. But Purple Heart and Hard Maple both are relatively stable woods. They're also very, very dense woods. So they have quite a bit of internal strength to resist the expansion and traction that if you froze it in place by gluing it, they've got quite a bit of structure to absorb some of that movement. They're really a nearly infinite number of variables to consider when it comes to this. So yeah, it's best to build for wood movement in mind, but I'd be willing to bet that most people will be surprised by exactly how much you can get away with wood movement. When you start to vary the species, when you start to factor in climate control, you'd be surprised how little the wood actually moves. You may notice it and you think, oh, that wood moved, but if you actually measure how much it moved, you might be surprised that it's only a 32nd of an inch, maybe a 16th at the most. The other thing that he brings up is he built it in that sweet spot of things getting hotter and things getting cooler when you've got that, middle ground. So if the board expands and contracts with seasonal movement, if you're building it in the spring, you're building it in the fall, it's kind of in the summer, it's this wide. In the winter, it's this wide. In the spring, it's in the middle. And in the fall, it's in the middle. And it's either going to expand a little bit more or it's going to shrink a little bit more. If you build it in the dead of winter, then it's got to go this whole distance to get to the spring. It may have to expand, an inch to get all the way to the spring. And it's going to shrink an inch into the winter. But if it's kind of halfway in between, it's going to move a fraction of that. Add to that the amelioration of climate control, and you can see how somebody could really get away with something like that relatively quickly. This is another question from Andrew. I honestly don't know if this is the same Andrew or not. He says, in this age of mass timber, which is stronger or better, laminated beams or solid wood? The thought came to my head after going to my local climbing gym. Let's see, he sent me a picture of his climbing gym. Where'd it go? There it is. There's the beam right there that he's talking about. He said, at my local climbing gym, the wood beams were used to construct the Pipeworks warehouse that was the original tenant of the building at the turn of the 20th century. Some of these supporting beams are 10 inches thick and 20 inches wide of solid wood. It looks like oak from here. Actually, I don't know. That could be pine. Yeah, that's probably pine. I often thought about what a pity it is to see these laminated support beams in newer buildings, but your episode made me think, are they really inferior? The solid wood really inferior to the laminated beams? So inferior, I'm not sure if that's the right word. In many ways, it's kind of an apples and oranges type conversation. Mass timber construction, and again, mass timber is a generic term for CLTs, cross-laminated timbers. GLTs are glue laminated timbers. Here, I got an image for you that will show you a little bit. So cross-laminated timber is like plywood, where you've got each layer at 90 degrees to the other. Glue lams or glue laminated timber, the grain is all running the same direction. They're all glued up together. You can have veneered version of that, or LVL. You can attach them together with dowels, or DLT, dowel laminated timber. You can attach them all together with nails, or nail laminated timber. The key here is mass timber is as strong as steel, but lighter than steel. As such, the dimensions are made instead of grown. So when you've got those big 10-inch thick, 20-inch wide beams, the tree had to grow that big, right? Well, we can take a bunch of smaller trees, glue them together, whether it's CLT, GLT, or whatever, to make that same 10 by 20. But here's the important part. Because of the greater strength provided by mass timber, you don't need to make it 20 inches wide and 10 inches thick. You wouldn't need to do that with a steel beam, and you can do the same thing since it's stronger than steel. So say, the equivalent, I'm making stuff up, but say the equivalent structural load could be handled by a 6x6 steel beam. Well, if mass timber is stronger than steel, then you could do, say, a CLT timber that is also 6x6, and it's going to be lighter than the steel. Sometimes it's even cheaper, depending on the cost of steel. So this is why mass timber has become such a big deal, because of its incredible strength properties, and its strength to weight ratio also makes it more able to handle dynamic loads, aka earthquakes. Great for that. Fatigue is not as much of an issue as it is with steel. So you could do the same thing with solid wood, and you'll get the same amount of structure. Wood in general is going to resist fatigue, unlike steel will. But with solid wood, you don't have that engineered structure of cross-lamination or GLT, glue lamination. Essentially, you have the way nature grew it. So you've got to get that big tree to begin with, and you're probably going to get one beam out of a tree. So it can be incredibly inefficient, whereas mass timber can make these beams with a bunch of different smaller trees, which certainly utilizes the resource a lot better. So is it as pretty? No, it's not. But the other thing you'll notice in those beams, see those big checks that run down the side? That's going to happen with solid structural beams. There's no way around that. It actually adds to the mystique, but if you don't want that rustic look, that's a problem. And trying to get interior beams that are structural, but that won't check to all, craziness, you've got to use a radio frequency vacuum kiln to pull that off. And that has a lot of limitations to it as well. Using a CLT or a glue lam or something like that, an LVL, you can end up with a more pleasing grain. And some LVL can actually look very similar to solid wood. Glue lam can also look very similar to solid wood as well. So yeah, it's really not fair to compare mass timber with solid wood. They're different entities, and we use them for different reasons. Well, I shouldn't say different reasons. We want them for structural reasons, but you can get away with it a lot easier, and you can make them rather than waiting for them to grow that way with mass timber. Okay, time to move on to our last question from Steven. I'm going to warn you. If I had a white lab coat, I'd be putting it on. We're going to dive deep at this point because this is a cool topic and I'm going to get real nerdy. So hang on here, folks. Steven says, I know that red oak is somewhat infamous in drying difficulty, but are other species also prone to this? Is TR ratio the best way to know you're going to have trouble drying a particular piece of wood? This is a loaded question. Is TR ratio an indicator of how difficult a species may be to dry? Well, to do that, we need to go into science mode. So let's look at this. One of the most, I think, notorious woods for drying difficulty is nogal. We're looking at in-grain magnification 10 times. This is straight from the Wood Database website of nogal. If you look at that, it is, let's make it bigger. That does not look very permeable, right? There is not a lot of moisture coming through that. And ultimately, the difficulty in drying comes down to its permeability. That permeability can be hindered by the cell structure. So softwoods, they're a much simpler structure, just a series of tracheids, really, and some rays. Hardwoods have a lot more going on. The porosity, the parenchyma, all that fun stuff makes a much more complex structure, which makes it harder for water to move through it. So when we look at just, while this is not the naked eye, this is 10 times magnification, just looking at that nogal in grain, you think, yeah, that is a dense wood. There's not a lot going on there. Another difficult wood to dry is red oak, which he mentioned. Well, here we got something else going on. We've got some big wide open pores, but look at the density of the material in between the pores. So red oak is like the poster child for ring porousness. It's got that really dense stuff between those wide open pores. But also look at that big vertical stripe right down the middle. That is a medullary ray. That's another thing that makes the structure less permeable, makes it harder to drive the moisture out, and can possibly create some structural barriers that can cause crazy warping and movement. And that's what makes, to define something, this wood is difficult to dry. What does that mean? It means that it's more prone to checking, it's more prone to warping, possible cell collapse, all kinds of nasty stuff. Usually has to do with its dimensional stability. Well, if there's physical structures that prevents water from dissipating, from moving out of the wood, that's going to cause warping, right? It's going to cause twisting. If it's really, really dense and adds a physical blockage of the water to move through, that's going to mean that you could stick it in the kiln, stick it there for 3 days, and it still comes out sopping wet. And nogal, a proving walnut, is actually known for that. You can stick it in the kiln for a while, and it's still green as the day you put it in there, even though the heat has been raised up, because there's so much density. I mean, looking at that image, you can imagine how difficult it would be to drive moisture out of that. So let's go back to Steven's question. Nogal, on the upper left there, has a TR ratio of 2.1. That is high. Red oak, also infamous for its difficulty to dry, has a TR ratio of 2.2. So yeah, that might be an indicator. And if you go onto the Wood Database and go to the wood filter and just go down to the TR ratio slider, slide the bottom into 2 and leave it on the high end, and just look at what you're getting. All of those species in there, you're going to look at them and say, these are hard woods, very dense woods. Or if they're not as dense, like red oak is quite a bit less dense than nogal. But what's the issue? It's got some weird structural things. What do we know about red oak and white oak and live oak? They have huge, big, fat medullary rays. And those medullary rays in the red oak example is what creates that difference in tangential and radial movement. So let's talk about, again, it's about permeability, right? Whether it's, a high TR ratio or not. What do we know? Moisture moves quickest longitudinally through a hardwood, and actually through a softwood as well, because you've got those bundle of fibers, right? Those straws. And the moisture, you could, in red oak, you can blow in the end of the straw and make bubbles on the other end, Wood moisture is going to move easily that way. The problem is there's a long distance. You've got an 8-foot board. that moisture has got to move, from the middle of the board. It's got to move 4 feet to get all the way near the end. There's a lot of surface tension in there. It can be very difficult to move all that water. And that free water that's just in those pores, in those tubes, it's going to cling through adhesion, adhesion to the cell walls, but also cohesion. The water molecules themselves are going to stick to the other water molecules, and it can require quite a bit of force or quite a bit of heat, some exterior factor external factor, I should say, to drive that moisture even to the path of least resistance longitudinally. Now, slicing an in-grain cookie, now suddenly I've got a 2-inch or 3-inch thick bit of in-grain that longitudinally, the water moves like 100 times faster than any other direction. You can dry out an in-grain cookie really quickly, which is why they're so prone to checking and cracking, because of that fast moisture exchange. Most of the moisture in a board as it's drying is removed tangentially or radially. And you'll find that it moves slightly faster tangentially than it does radially. Which does kind of make sense for some of the isometric nature of wood moving one way or the other, because radially there's usually some other structures there, more importantly, or namely the medullary rays, which prevent actual barriers, prevent moisture permeability, but it also acts more like a skeletal structure, and it holds that wood stable. So just looking at that big fat medullary ray in that in-grain of red oak, you can see how as moisture were moving radially, vertically, it is going to bump into some of those things. As it's moving tangentially, it's going to hit those walls of medullary rays, and it's going to run into issues there. The density of the wood in between the pores is also going to cause some problems. Looking at the nogal on the left, there's no clear path through there. And in fact, moisture dissipation tangentially and radially is relying upon what's known as pits, or small holes in the cell walls themselves that allow the transport of moisture. And what you find is nogal is really prone to cell collapse as you're drying it. As things are heated up, there's so much pressure, there's no place for that water to go. The permeability is so low that all the water is forced into those pits. And with that pressure of the water moving through those specific areas, it can actually cause that cell wall to collapse. And sometimes it even implodes on itself, and you get the walls that actually collapse. And you look along the surface of the board, and you'll see these kind of undulating parts where the cell wall is just given up and literally collapsed like a house, because there's just no place for the moisture to go through here. So if we look at this, we've got free water, right? I've talked about this. Free water is just hanging out in the pores. It is not bound to the cell walls at all. It's bound in place through static cling, if you will, adhesion to friction on the walls of the pores, and cohesion, the attraction of one water molecule to another. Look at a drip hanging off the end of a faucet. You've got some adhesion to the rim of the faucet, but that drip, the little part at the bottom of the drip, that's cohesion, water clinging to other water molecules. Both of those come into play that prevent the free water from just rolling out there. Capillary action really is what we're talking about, that's causing that moisture to wick up into the pores through surface adhesion. That water is drowned out first. And I mentioned earlier in this episode, you drive that free water out, you're still at 25 to 30% moisture content. What's left is bound water. Bound water is literally bound to the wood via hydrogen bonds. Wood is mostly hydroxyl compounds, OH negative compounds, negatively charged compounds. Water is actually a polar molecule. H2O, the hydrogen element, is positive and the oxygen is negative. So you've got a negative side of the molecule and a positive side. Hey, hang loose, man. So that hydrogen side will bond to the hydroxyl compounds and in the cellulose and the hemicellulose and the glucose and all that stuff. And it literally chemically bonds. You get that covalent bond sharing of the positive hydrogen and the negative hydroxyl compound. That's what we mean when we say bound water. If you took organic chemistry, you're having post-traumatic flashbacks. I'm with you right now. The cellulose, the hemicellulose, the lignin molecules, all in the cell wall have those hydroxyl groups that are negatively charged. But the physical structure can cause problems as well. And I said that. Let's look at the cell itself. So again, this is one of those things where you're probably going to want to go to YouTube and watch the visuals because there's a lot of imagery going on here. So in the top left, we have kind of the macro look at a cell. You know, got that center of the cell, the wood fiber there. We've got two hexagonal shaped fibers stuck to one another. You've got the outer wall. You've got what's known as the middle lamella. That's the part in between the fibers. So we always look at cell or wood fibers as a bundle of straws, right? The area between the straws, that's called the middle lamella. That's mostly composed of lignin and pectin. Pectin, you probably used it in your kitchen. Pectin is a starch or a thickening agent. You use it to make jams and jellies and things like that. Well, pectin combined with a lignin creates the matrix, which all of those cells float in and are bound together. It's the glue that holds each one of those fibers together. And the middle lamella chemical composition is one of the things that can relate to shearing strength of a particular wood. High shearing strength on wood, or really difficult to plane off a shaving that wood, has a lot to do with that middle lamella, but also a little bit to the structure, the chemical composition of the outer cell wall. Once you move past the outer cell wall, then you've got the secondary cell wall. And the image on the bottom talks about the secondary cell wall because that's really wood. That's the wood part of a tree. That's the structure part of a tree. But going back to the top image, if we look at each tube in wood fiber as, call it a macrofibril. Well, each one of those long tubes is comprised of smaller tubes or microfibrils. And those microfibrils can be in a longitudinal bundle. They can be different angles. They can swirl around in like a double helix pattern, like I've got here. You can have these microfibrils spinning around either in a double helix, two different directions, or moving in one direction around that, all together, bound together to create that larger macrofibril structure. A lot of different structures going on in the cell wall here and a lot of different chemical compositions. As we move into the secondary cell wall, and you look at the plant cell is right smack in the middle. The secondary cell wall is broken into three different subsections, S1, S2, and S3. S1 and S3, not really that important to things. They're quite thin. And if you look at this image, you can see the blue and this kind of olive color, this kind of chartreuse color and this kind of olive color. That's S1, that's S3. This big wide brown band in the middle is S2. That's where cellulose, hemicellulose, and a lot of lignin are. Lignin is very stiff. Lignin is very hard. The thickness of that S2 wall is directly related to your stiffness and your bending strength for that matter. So your MOR and your MOE. And based upon the chemical composition and the structure, the physical structure of that S2 wall is how strong, going back to my episode on strength, how strong that particular species of wood can be. But at the same time, these S1, S2, and S3 are that image I showed earlier of that kind of helix structure of the cellulose microfibrils wrapping around the cell walls. It's like plywood, where S1 will be wrapping one direction. S3 can be wrapping the other direction. The outer cell wall can be going both directions at once, creating that double helix pattern. S2 generally tends to be oriented closer to parallel to the long axis. So we talk about how the long axis of a tree and the grain is running up the long axis of that tree. Well, if you're splitting out wood, you're splitting along the grain, you're keeping those grain parallel. But look at this image on the bottom. You see that brown thick bit of S2 there. Notice these lines running vertical there. The angle of those microfibrils in the S2 wall directly relate to the strength. So you can have an angle of that microfibril, known as microfibril angle, or MFA for short. The lower that angle, the closer you are to parallel, the stronger that wood is. The higher the angle, the more you deviate away from the long axis of the tree or the cell fiber, the weaker, the more prone to breaking that can be. But as moisture is moving, and moisture is moving longitudinally, that's great. But if you've got this angle or you've got a low angle, moisture is trying to butt straight through that microfibril angle, and that causes real problems. The strengthness of the tree is actually prohibiting the movement of moisture through that. This is what actually causes some of that TR ratio, that difference in tangential and radial movement, is of all these structures that are going around in there. So again, going back to this image on the bottom, this orange S1 layer, you can see, patterns going in both directions, creating that double helix kind of interlocked crystalline structure. That's all around your primary wall. Your S1 is having the same thing, moving, overlapping different angles, kind of double helix-like. Your inner wall can be any number of things, but they tend to be turned left or turned to the right. They're all moving in the same way. It's that secondary wall where they're running straight up and down, or some angle, some MFA to that longitudinal axis, which is creating that strength, but also that physical structure that's preventing moisture from moving through it. The differences in MFA is what creates the TR ratio. And the higher the TR ratio, the more deviation you're going to find in that microfibril angle. And therefore, the long answer to the question is yes, the higher the TR ratio, the more difficult it will be to dry that wood. Now, I could have said that in 30 seconds, right? But if you're like me, you want to know why. Why does the higher TR ratio make it more difficult? Higher TR ratio means that the wood, the structure of the wood, is prohibiting movement tangentially and prohibiting movement radially in different amounts. And that's because of these interlocking secondary cell wall components, S1, S2, and S3, and the angle caused by those microfibril angles as they change from one cell wall to another. So the TR ratio is related to the structure. I'm going to read this because there's a lot of science in here. Couple of things that affect the TR ratio, and we can look at this as a macroscopic level down to a microscopic level. Macroscopically, the alternation of late wood and early wood increments within the annual rings. So we talk about contrast in those annular rings. High contrast. This is a piece of lodgepole pine. Huge amount of contrast from early wood to late wood. Well, this is a density thing. That late wood is super, super dense. You can imagine moisture trying to move across those bands, that's going to cause problem. But also the density change in movement provided by those different bands, that's going to affect the TR ratio. Douglas fir, here's a great example. This is a particularly fine-grained Douglas fir, but you can see the stark contrast from early growth to late growth. That provides that physical barrier and moisture barrier for dispersal, moisture dispersal. Well, what does that also tell us? If one area disperses moisture faster, the lighter section of lower density, and the darker section disperses moisture slower, within the annual ring is comprised of both early and late growth. Within that ring itself, you've got a moisture differential, which creates a higher TR ratio and more difficulty in drying it. The next kind of macroscopic thing to look at is the introduction of medullary rays. The influence of wood rays on the radial direction. I like to use the bike wheel as an example of that. Even though the bike wheel, these spokes are actually holding the hub in tension, but think of like an old wooden wheel where you've got spokes that are mortised into a central hub. Those spokes prevent compression. They hold the structure of the wheel. Without the spokes, the wheel would be quite flimsy. Well, each one of these spokes is a medullary ray. And if I was looking at down the long axis, the end grain of a log, that's what the medullary rays are going to look like. A wheel is my easy example. Here is the end grain of white oak. This is quarter sawn into rift over here, quartered over here. These vertical lines, well, those are growth rings. But if you look real close, if I can get it to focus, in between all that are a bunch of different lines running perpendicular to those growth rings. Those are the medullary rays. And if I look on the face, you can start to see the medullary rays popping out here. Those long ray structures provide physical barriers, but they also have a dramatically higher density than a wood around it. Medullary rays is basically a waste transport system. As sugars are metabolized in the sapwood, and once they're used up, the waste products created from that are transported into the heartwood via the medullary rays. Basically, it's the landfill. All the crap, all the tree crap runs into the center of the tree, which is why heartwood has a darker color than the sapwood. That's the waste depot. Well, each one of those medullary rays is that transport system. It's chocked full of crap, essentially much, much higher density, but also essentially a non-living part of the tree. It's just compacting in there, getting denser and denser and denser. Well, that density is going to create a moisture barrier. It's also going to create a skeletal structure like the wheel. These spokes create strength and prevent compression. As I hit a big bump, my tire, which doesn't have any air in it at the moment, is going to compress. But if you ever compress it so much that you hit your rim, if there was not a spoke there, that rim would crumple and fold in seconds. The spokes, or the medullary rays, provide that skeletal structure that makes the wood move less radially than it will tangentially. So that's the next kind of macroscopic look. Moving microscopically, the features of the cell wall itself, the structure, such as the microfibril angle, or the MFA, the different modifications you'll see in that microfibril angle, and the pits. I talked earlier about how the pits are the small areas that allow the transport of moisture through the cell wall. And there's not a lot of them. They're in very specific areas based on the species. Well, something like nogal has no permeability and very few pits, so there's a lot of pressure on that pit. Think of somebody that has high blood pressure. You've got a lot of buildup of plaque in your arteries and your veins, and you're driving, every time your heart pumps, it's driving through that tiny little hole, and your blood pressure goes way, way up. And the smaller that hole gets, the higher your blood pressure gets. Well, the pits in nogal are tiny, and there's not that many of them, so you've got a high amount of water pressure as it's trying to move through there. Whatever external source is forcing that dissipation of moisture in a kiln, it's heat, essentially. It's trying to go through there, and if you push it too hard, you tear the cell wall and it collapses on you. That's the nogal problem. Same thing with a medullary ray to a lesser extent. It's preventing that, and the water's got to go somewhere. It can't really go through it because of the density. It's got to find another place to go. And maybe it has to curve around it. Maybe it's just as simple as deviating it around it, but it still lengthens the path that moisture, that water molecule has to go through to dissipate, to come in equilibrium with the gaseous pressure on the outside. Equilibrium moisture content is equal pressure on either side of the cell wall. So when we look at branches, tension wood is going to have a microfibril angle nearly parallel to the long axis. So I've got a branch, if the trunk is over here, gravity is wanting to pull down on this branch. So the wood on top is in tension, it's being pulled down. Well, those microfibrils are being stretched and straightened out. So look at like a rubber band. As I pull it out, they're getting stretched and they're getting very, very parallel. As I release the pressure on that, or the underside of the branch, which is in compression, as I push this, you see how my parallel microfibrils become not parallel and they change angle. That's the same thing that's happening to that branch on the underside. It's sagging and the wood is compressing, and you're getting that much higher microfibril angle. So the compression wood is substantially weaker, substantially less stiff than the tension wood, where you're pulling it parallel to the long axis of that branch or that cell wall at a microscopic level. Now go back to that structure of the secondary wall where you have S1, S2, and S3. Each one of those layers is going to have a different microfibril angle. And now we're getting into like plywood construction, where we've got the microfibril, the MFA going this way on one wall, and the MFA going this way on the other wall, and the MFA going straight up and down on the third wall. Laminating those layers together like a mass timber, you end up with something that's incredibly structurally sound and can be lightweight. So microscopically, nature has already created cross-laminated timber within the secondary cell wall, which is kind of fascinating. But you can imagine the more complex that structure is, the more variance in microfibril angle along the length of that cell fiber, from a tree branch to a trunk to the center part of the trunk to way up in the canopy, those microfibril angles are going to change, and they're going to produce different moisture permeabilities and therefore different difficulties in drying, or different TR ratios. That's really where that TR ratio change comes to bear. So to bring all this pseudoscience together, the high TR ratio is a good indicator of how difficult it will be to dry. Size and or the distribution of the rays is also an indicator. So a really, really dense wood's probably going to have a high TR ratio. But a wood that's got really big fat medullary rays is probably also going to have a high TR ratio. Wood that's super dense with big fat medullary rays, that's going to have a ridiculously high TR ratio. Highly volatile, resinous, high amounts of extractives can also be an indicator of something that's going to be difficult to dry. Those extractives, those other things, going to interfere with the chemical composition, and they're going to create cohesion issues. As that water molecule moves through and it bumps into this other volatile organic compound, it's going to get held up, and it's going to cause problems, slowing of moisture transport in one area and maybe faster moisture transport around it, which causes that delta, which causes drying defects. So really, really resinous woods might not have that high of a TR ratio, but if you look close and you compare something relatively innocuous, a pretty straightforward, unextractive wood like Douglas fir, pretty vanilla when it comes to extractives and resins. Take cypress, which is full of oils and resins and extractives that create all kinds of chemical compositions, which is what you get, kind of streaky different patterns in the wood. It's those reactions to those various extractives that can cause difficulty in drying as well. Cypress can be hard to dry, can also be prone to cell collapse because of all the other volatile compounds that are interacting and interfering with the water as you're trying to dry it. In the end, like I said, the short answer could be yes, TR ratio is an indicator of how difficult it is to dry wood. Put another way, how much possible warping and movement you could see while in the kiln. So I'm sorry I didn't just answer it with that 30 seconds. Yes, that's the answer. I really wanted to dive deeper in and show you just how incredibly complex the wood cell is. And having that understanding of that structure of the wood cell will make you incredibly boring at parties, but it'll also begin to understand why this wood is moving the way it is. It also reveals a lot about why this wood is strong, why this wood planes well, why this wood saws well, why this wood is great. It's a great stiffness, why this wood is great for a bow and arrow, why I can build a bridge out of this. All of those we talk about at a macro level. This is the microscopic reasoning. And ultimately, if you look at that cell wall, that secondary cell wall 2, that S2 wall, and the MFA of those hemicellulose and cellulose structures winding around that cell wall, that will tell you a great deal about how strong that wood is and how difficult it may be to dry. That was a mouthful. So thank you to everybody who sent in these questions. Thank you for listening through this. I'm sorry I didn't have my white lab coat. I probably should have had it for this particular episode. I went to new levels of nerddom on this particular episode, and I appreciate you sticking with me. If you have additional questions, let me know. As I said, you can always reach me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. You can look me up at lumberupdateshow on Instagram, or just go to lumberupdate.com and submit your questions there. And if you really like this show and want to support it, patreon.com/lumberupdate. So between now and then, go buy some dried wood and get some respect for how difficult it may have been to dry that particular wood. Let's play you out. Bye, everybody.